Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics and Prime Minister's questions again today, except I say again, this was the first time that we've had a Prime Minister's questions where the Prime Minister was actually there and the new Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer, as well. So what I'm going to do in these ones is to go through the key questions, especially, of course, from the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer, as well as the Leader of the SNP in Westminster, Ian Blackford, which of course represents the second largest party on the opposition benches. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, then please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, Boris Johnson's first PMQs against Keir Starmer. So this is how PMQs are supposed to be and are going to be for a little while. Obviously, it's still the setup with the coronavirus measures in place where very few MPs are actually in the chamber, many of them coming in remotely via Zoom or whatever it is they're using. As expected, he did bumble his way through quite a lot. Now, you have to bear in mind, some of his and ahhing, you might sort of think, oh, he's getting caught off guard. A lot of it is an act. He's deliberately developed this buffoonish act to try and throw people off guard, to hide just how calculated and ruthless he is. But there were a couple of times when he really was stuck. He bumbled his way through several seconds, not just a bit of and ahhing before answering. But anyway, on to some of the questions. So, the first question was actually just a random question about tourism, ignoring that one. So the ones that were put forward by the Leader of the Opposition, who gets 6 questions. And what I've said before in these things is what's really crucial for me is you don't just ask 6 questions. In fact, I dislike it when they ask 6 questions because that's pointless. Because guaranteed, when you ask a question, the Prime Minister will attempt to deflect it. So you have to be able to come back, which of course means that your 6th question, the Prime Minister and they will know that they get to just come back with whatever crap they want to come out with, and you don't get another question to follow up with. And the other thing is, if you get into a pattern of always asking just 6 questions, the Prime Minister knows they can deflect everyone and none of them ever hit home. So Keir Starmer noted that the Prime Minister, when he returned to work officially, was talking about our apparent success. And he says, but we know that at least 29,000 have lost their lives due to COVID. In reality, we know it's much more. Everyone knows it's much more. But he said at least, because he's having to go along with the government's figures. He said this is the highest in Europe, the second highest in the world. He said it's not a success. And he asked the question to the Prime Minister, how did it come to this? Now, of course, and this is what I mean about keep following on, because obviously Boris Johnson did not actually answer the question, because the question was, how did it come to this? What he did say was that at this stage, international comparisons are not really there to be made. Maybe this can be done later on, can't really do it now. And he tried to say that his priority was always to save lives and protect the NHS. And he said that his priority now, which was much more believable, was to suppress the disease and get the economy back on its feet. Of course, his major focus now is going to be the economy. We're expecting an announcement this Sunday. He should have really made the announcement to the House of Commons. He's not. He's making it to the public before letting the Commons debate it for his plan for easing the lockdown. But we'll come on to that later. And this is the importance of coming back. So bear in mind, Boris Johnson was asked the question, how did it come to this? This is a disaster. He didn't answer it. So then Keir Starmer, when Boris Johnson had said, well, look, I don't think it's really valid to be making comparisons right now, Keir Starmer pointed out that the government have been making comparisons for weeks. And it's not just Tory backbenchers. People have been digging up old tweets from Tory MPs who at the start of this were drawing comparisons between us and other nations. Obviously, we were behind the curve on everyone else, but they were treating it as if we were the same position on the curve. So they were drawing lots of international comparisons, saying how great the UK was coping. Those same MPs are now tweeting, well, you can't really make comparisons, but the government themselves were doing it. Early on in the process, they were making those comparisons. And now all of a sudden, they don't want to make those comparisons. So Starmer pointed that out. He also then, building up to his second question, was saying, well, look, the UK was slow to the lockdown, slow on testing, slow on PPE provision, and made the point that the deaths in care homes continued to go up. And he said that the Deputy Chief Scientific Officer had said that, this shows, or advisor rather, in the case of the scientific advisor, so that this shows that we need to get to grips with what's happening in care homes. She said that just yesterday. And he also noted that 12 weeks after the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, said that this was a crisis, why haven't we got to grips with the situation in care homes? And again, the importance of coming back here. So Boris Johnson then, he agreed that there was an epidemic going on in care homes. And he said he regrets that. But then he tried to say Keir Starmer was incorrect about his stats. He says, no. In the past few days, there's been palpable improvements. The importance of coming back to the point. So then, third question, Keir Starmer said, well, hang on a minute. I'm using the government statistics, the government figures for care homes that were used in the press conference yesterday, which is the latest press conference. That's the latest government figures. So basically, what Boris Johnson is trying to say is, oh yeah, but you haven't got the latest data. The latest data shows that actually it's going down. Well, the data that the government have released as the latest data doesn't show that, is the point he was making. And then the other thing that Starmer pointed out, just to avoid Boris Johnson getting away with being able to say, okay, but it is now coming down. You'll see when we release the next few days, which may be true, by the way. But to avoid that, Keir Starmer did actually point out that a week ago, his deputy was saying that care home deaths were going down. Well, we now have, even if the results, the data that we have from the government is a few days out of date, it shows what it was, the position that it was last week, and shows that it was still rising. So at the point when it was definitely still rising, according to the government's own figures, the government was saying that it was falling. So why should we now believe them when they say it's falling right now? But then he came on to his next question, which was very much about testing. Obviously, we know that the government fiddled the figures on testing to make it sound like they'd blown their 100,000 a day target out the water on the 30th of April, which they had not. Because Keir Starmer was pointing out, well, it's funny now, isn't it, that after this point, the number of tests being carried out a day has been falling. It's a week later, and it's still not up to 100,000 a day. 100,000 a day doesn't mean on one day, it means every day. 100,000 a day. I wouldn't even mind if it was an average of 100,000 a day. I mean, call it 700,000 a week if you like. That's fine. So what he said was, so it's a bit funny this, the old tests straight after April the 30th seem to be going down. What was so special about April the 30th? Now this is where, if you want some criticism, I would have criticised it. I would have pointed out that actually they fiddled the figures with 50,000 erroneous test kits sent out, which isn't tests done. In fact, quite a lot of those test kits sent out were actually useless. So if you want some criticism of the way he went about it, I would have emphasised that. He asked the question, what was so special about April the 30th? To which Boris Johnson said, yes, capacity is still exceeding demand, but the ambition is to get up to 200,000 per day, which is a little bit odd because I thought the target was 250,000 per day, but doesn't matter. I'm not going to hold them to pulling numbers out of thin air anyway. The ambition is to get up to 200,000 a day, fine. And he said, absolutely, the testing regime is critical, which basically means that he's not answering the question again, but again, he's never going to answer the question. This isn't about getting the Prime Minister to answer questions. They never will, unless, if they've got something to hide, they never will. It's about pinning them down and catching them out. And on this particular case, the Prime Minister was basically going, we're not testing 100,000 a day. He basically couldn't counter that. But I still think, it would have been a bigger hit if you emphasise the fact that on no day have they actually hit 100,000 tests a day. No point. And also to have made the point that you can't just claim to make it on one day or a couple of days and that you've somehow hit it. You haven't hit it until you're consistently doing it. And he didn't do that. So if you want some criticism, that would be my criticism of it. But then on to the fourth question. So then Starmer was saying, well, just having a target isn't a strategy. It's all right saying 100,000 a day and then you go into 200,000 a day. That's not a strategy. Your strategy is how you get there. The strategy is testing, tracking and tracing. And we were told by the government that this wasn't appropriate a while ago. But all of a sudden now it is. And also what we're told is, again, the Deputy Chief Scientific Advisor yesterday was saying that the reason we abandoned this strategy of testing, tracking and tracing, which was the thing we should have stuck with throughout the whole time, was because of capacity. And he asked if the Prime Minister could clarify that. And actually, the Prime Minister did clarify that. He said, yes, this was to do with capacity. He obviously didn't phrase it as, yes, this was to do with the capacity. I lied when I said it was to do with the science. But he did say it was to do with capacity. So he has contradicted what he and his government were saying a while ago without admitting it to the House. So that just means you have to join two things together. What he said in the House today, which was, yes, it was to do with capacity, with what he was saying some weeks ago, which was the science said it wasn't appropriate. So that was an easy win. The fifth question, the Prime Minister, so Keir Starmer was just pointing out for anyone who wasn't paying attention. Okay, thank you. You've just clarified that it was a capacity issue. So he got that on record. Then he went on to PPE, of course, talking about the British Medical Association, saying that 48% of doctors have had to buy their own PPE or rely upon donations. He says there's an obvious problem that is going to get more acute as more people are asked to return to work. Of course, that's going to risk more infections. And what he said is, are you going to assure people that they are not going to be asked to return to work until a plan for adequate PPE is in place? And the Prime Minister did that. He did confirm that people will not be asked to go to work until the PPE plan is in place. So again, good, fine. And he also said we're able to satisfy these PPE needs in the long term. Now, that wouldn't be satisfactory to me. It's like, well, okay, grand. What about the short term? Because you want us to start returning to work in the short term. So can we satisfy these needs in the short term? That's more important. And of course, he said he would be setting out his plan on Sunday. So then into the sixth question, Keir Starmer came on to that point. And he says, look, you've got millions on furlough, millions who are struggling with care responsibilities of various kinds. So he says, to return to work, these people are going to need reassurance on the plan. And he said, will the Prime Minister come to the House on Monday with it? Because the Prime Minister's already announced that he's announcing his plan on Sunday, which is totally out of order. The Speaker of the House had already admonished him for that by saying, look, you should have brought this to the House first. You don't announce it to the public. You bring it to Parliament first and let Parliament debate and approve or not of it. But he hasn't. He's going to announce it on Sunday. So Keir Starmer says, will the Prime Minister come to the House on Monday with his plan to be asked questions about it, to face scrutiny? So first of all, Boris Johnson explained why it was happening on Sunday. He said, well, this is because the plan isn't decided upon now. It needs the next few days of data to support the plan. But he wants some of the measures to come online on Monday. So he's announcing it on Sunday as if it's all perfectly reasonable to give people a day's notice of what's going to be happening on Monday. And again, there'll be people going, oh, that sounds reasonable, that sounds reasonable. But it's not, because think it through. If they don't have the plan right now, how do they know anything's coming online on Monday? How do they know there's measures that they're going to be implemented actually on Monday? Not announcing, implementing. How do they know that if the plan isn't complete? And if you're trying to argue, oh, it's probably only a bit of the plan that's incomplete. Okay, so why doesn't he announce the parts of the plan that are definitely known in the House this week? It's absolutely bogus. But of course, that was the end of Keir Starmer's questions. So there was no possibility to come back on that one. So that was that one. I will go through, as I always would, a point like this to the SNP's questions, because they are the second largest party on the opposition benches as well. So Ian Blackford gets two questions as the leader of the second largest party on the opposition benches. And he was again noting, just as Keir Starmer did, the highest death rate in Europe. And he wanted to draw the Prime Minister into agreeing that, because the Prime Minister pretty much said this anyway, that the worst thing we could do was to ease the lockdown and allow a second wave. And he also drew attention to people making unlawful trips, against the rules. And he says, will the Prime Minister remind everyone that non-essential travel is not permitted and we should only be led by the best scientific advice? To which Boris Johnson wholeheartedly agreed, and he had said this before himself quite clearly. And he also said he'd be working with the Scottish Government, with unions, with businesses, with other oppositions as well in the country to get the lockdown plan right, which sort of suggests that he's not going to announce his plan until he's already discussed it with these various other people. Unfortunately, these people at the moment know nothing about it. So I'm wondering what discussions there's usefully going to be in just like a few days. But, you know, he did at least say it would be an absolute economic disaster if we risked a second spike. Then the second question from Ian Blackford was that some of, you know, it's nice to hear the Prime Minister saying that and saying it so clearly, but some of his own ministers are not following his own advice. The Scottish Secretary, for example, has been making arguments based on politics and not the science. And he said he anticipates the Prime Minister making his lockdown plan known on Sunday, but will all devolved governments be included before the plan is announced? To which the Prime Minister did say that he'll do his best to make sure that the outlines of the plan will receive as wide a consensus as possible. Seemed a little bit vague. What I would take from that is when he says outlines, he's not going to be discussing the full plan with anyone. So the answer would actually just be no, I'm not going to tell you about it before I announce it to the public. He's just going to discuss the outlines of plans, and it's going to be a case of, look, like it or lump it. I'm giving you, he'll give them just before his announcement on Sunday probably a little bit of an idea about the outline of it, take a few questions and then just ignore them, is how I would read that. So that was Prime Minister's questions this week. That was Boris Johnson's first Prime Minister's questions, not only during the lockdown measures, but also with the new Labour leader. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, then please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.